Hello to everybody, my name is Rocío Riestra-Camacho and I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Oviedo in Spain. In this video presentation, I will introduce you to some of the preliminary findings of a reading experiment that I conducted with Emily Troscianko at the Oxford Research Centre in the Humanities from September to November 2019. Even though, it was only finished per se just a couple of weeks ago, so last month. So really everything is pretty preliminary. Before delving into some of these preliminary results, however, I want to talk first of some of the basics of this reading experiment, so you have an overall view of it ahead. Basically, this reading experiment, which is part of my PhD thesis at the University of Oviedo, evaluates the relationship between bibliotherapy and anorexia. You may know this word, bibliotherapy, from therapy and biblio, book. So basically, bibliotherapy is the field where you try to assist people's well-being, namely their mental health, through reading literature. And anorexia is one of the best well-known eating disorders, and is actually considered the deadliest mental illness, excuse me, as of today. The hypothesis between this reading experiment was that giving participants 2 young adult sports novels, together or not with a reading guide, would reduce their vulnerability to this condition, to anorexia. The novels object of study in this experiment are Miranda Kennelly's Breathe, Annie Breathe and Camina for Air from 2015 and 2017. Respectively, so they are pretty contemporary US examples of fiction. In a nutshell, the reading guide consisted of pop-up messages that I explicitly designed for the purposes of this reading experiment. They were placed in the right-hand margin of the books, which were given electronically through Google Documents to the participants. And if you are wondering about the format of the experiment, of course, you can write an email to me, and I will be delighted to talk more about this. So the reading guides, the principle behind the reading guides basically was that of making explicit and salient the kind of healthy mindset that the protagonists in these 2 set novels display throughout the stories. Now, healthy is a quite slippery label. What is healthy? What is not? But just bear me with this, and with healthy in this case, I mean that, for example, if the protagonists in these novels exercise a lot because they are professional, or they have engaged with sports in a quite serious way, they nourish and feed their bodies accordingly, and they display along the story quite a positive body image, which girls do not always display in young adult fiction, for example. So this is what I mean when I say healthy mindset. Right, so the reading guides basically made explicit and salient this kind of attitudes of the protagonist, and it also asked participants to kind of be convinced of this mindset themselves. So they were really trying to persuade them to adopt the same kind of healthy mindset that the protagonists have in the novels. The procedure in the experiment was as follows. First, participants had to complete a questionnaire. This questionnaire contained the set of questions for the E26, which is a standardized psychometric test to measure vulnerability to eating disorders, including anorexia. The questionnaire also included a set of questions that I specifically designed for this experiment, and which go along the same lines that the E26, namely assessing vulnerability and over concern about eating, dieting attitudes, and exercising, and generally about self concerns with body image and so on. After they completed the questionnaire, they were assorted to one of the experimental groups. On the one hand, the experimental group, which was comprised of the participants who were receiving the novels together with together with the reading guides, and the control group, on the other hand, which was conformed by participants who were just receiving the novels as they have been published, in order to see the difference that the reading guides make in reducing participants' vulnerability to suffering an eating disorder. Well, it's important to state that none of the participants had an active diagnosis of an eating disorder, because you never know what's going to happen after an experiment, and whether it could actually be dangerous for someone with an eating disorder to be reading this kind of literature. And I will say something more about this in the next slide. In the end, 65 participants completed the study as a whole, and we had 33 in the control group and 32 in the experimental group. After they had completed the questionnaire and read the novels, they did basically a repeat of the questionnaire and a voluntary Skype interview of about 15 to 20 minutes with me in order to complement the kind of quantitative data yielded by the quantitative tests, so the questionnaire in this sense. In the data analysis, which is still being conducted by James Carney, whose contact details you have in the description of the text below. Basically, he's using SPSS, which is a really well-known computer engineering software used in data analysis in psychological experiments. And however, the kind of preliminary analysis that I've conducted just until a couple of weeks ago was done using Excel. And I'm conducting also at the same time a corpus discourse analysis of the transcripts of the interviews, which I myself transcribed. And now I will discuss these very preliminary results, right? So basically, through the Excel analysis, I could see that participants in the experimental group, on average, decreased their scoring in the questionnaire. And while very interestingly, those in the control group actually increased their scoring on average. This means that participants in the experimental group did improve their relationship towards eating and exercising, in theory, decreasing their vulnerability to an eating disorder, while curiously and contrary to what the hypothesis was evaluating, those in the control group actually had worsened their perceptions towards the body in this vulnerability trait. So what this could be suggesting is that the novels themselves and alone, without guidance, actually have an iatrogenic effect over participants with a vulnerability to having a disordered relationship with their bodies. Iatrogenic in this context means that while something is intended to help someone as a kind of treatment for a patient, let's say, it actually becomes harmful for this participant unintendedly. So this is what I mean with iatrogenic. While the reading guides are definitely and even more clearly than if this result had not appeared in the control group, are really bibliotherapeutic and paving the way for participants to reduce their vulnerability to a disordered relationship with their bodies. For more information about the kind of harmful or beneficial effects of literature, you may want to peek into Emily Troscianko's website, whose address you have in the text description below as well. These conclusions are very interesting, and in order to close this presentation, I would actually like to talk about the ethical responsibility that the researchers in the humanities are increasingly having. We may not agree with the fact that the sciences can assist us. There's a debate about this, for example, in the way that cognitive literary studies are actually updating the kind of methods used in literary analysis with insights from psychology or neurology. This is a debate, but definitely we really have to assume in the increasingly interdisciplinary field of the humanities that we have an ethical responsibility to those who consume the kind of analysis that we do. For example, as regards writers or publishing houses, we have this role in determining what is produced out there, what is recommended out there, because really, if we are beginning to test that literature or culture more generally can play a role in the well-being and mental health of people, then we should be careful in stating that generally culture, art, literature, and fiction are good forms of entertainment, because they can be more than sources of entertainment, and we could benefit from actually taking it seriously. The fact that we can, or we should rather, start testing this very well-known assumption behind culture, and start conducting or reducing our awkwardness when we hear the words reading, experiment, or clinical humanities, and start seeing the bright side of incorporating the sciences into our methods without rejecting the intrinsic value that culture has and will have in the future per se.